talk a little bit about Kingwood Center Gardens, located in the heart of Mansfield. But we're going to touch a little bit on the history and then where we are today. Do you mind if I take this off?
Yeah, that's fine.
You good, Mike? You might hear me a little bit better.
You're far enough away, so.
So, Kingwood is centered mainly around Kingwood Hall, which is situated on 47 acres in Mansfield. It was built in 1926 by Charles Taylor King. Construction began in 1926 in the French provincial style and designed by the architect Clarence Grant. Mr. King died in 1952, so it's when Kingwood became a public garden in 1953. He left his estate to be a horticultural institution for the community. So there's a private foundation set up for the organization. The mansion itself is mainly used for administrative offices, and I touched on the expansion that we have going on or just finished. So administrative offices have just come out of Kingwood Hall. Kingwood Hall has been open for tours or just guided, self-guided tours in the first and second floor. But now for the first time ever, that third floor, which was mainly administrative offices, is going to be open. Mainly Mr. and Mrs. King's living quarters. We're going to slowly hope to expand on that. Mr. King didn't leave a lot of his furniture or things like that. He didn't necessarily want the house to be a showcase. It was mostly for operations for the garden. So who was Mr. King? Mr. Charles Taylor King. He's originally from Maine. And moved to Mansfield to work with a small startup called Ohio Brass. Ohio Brass really made it big by making electrical fittings for the railroads and trolley cars. So he was hired in 1893 and eventually became president and chairman of the board, and that's really where he gained his wealth. Mansfield was a bustling town at the time. Mr. King was an active man, and his 47 acre estate suited him well with that lifestyle. So, horseback, ice skating on his pond. The picture of this duck pond, actually, the duck pond is still there today. And that's some of the history right there. The duck pond predated the mansion. So he originally moved into a home on the property prior to the 1926 start of his mansion. But the duck pond and his greenhouses were there prior to the mansion. So he was a very active man, and he loved birds and ducks. So the duck pond was used for a variety of purposes, raising ducks, as you saw before, ice skating, and also a water source for his livestock. But not only did Mr. King enjoy the duck pond, but kids since the garden opened in the 50s, it's been a place of enjoyment for kids and adults alike, and it still is today. It's one of the most common questions or comments we get is that people love the memories of feeding the ducks in the duck pond. So we still have feeders out. It's so simple but nostalgic. Grandparents bringing their kids and grandkids, and it's that same memory, and it sticks with them through their lifetime. Not only ducks, but we also have peacocks. There's some records that do show Mr. King had peacocks, but it's one of our main attractions is people always want to see the peacocks in full show. So this is a male. We currently have about 5 males and 1 female. We do have some critter problems that we got to protect a little bit, but they're always a sight to see.
I don't know, so in the winter, can they just stroll around, or do you need to have shelter for peacocks in the winter? I don't know that much about it.
When it's very, very cold, we do let them into our garages, but for the most part, they can handle the cold weather. There's another shot. They love to roost, and right now they're very active mating season. They just get a little bit territorial, but over the course of the summer, pretty calm, and you'll just find them roosted on walls and pergolas and up in the trees. They do roost in the trees overnight to protect themselves. So as I mentioned, Mr. King had an affinity for birds, and it's shown here in this image of Mr. King's original hen house for his greenhouse in the dovecotes. So, to take that into consideration when building, you had, you familiar with what a dovecote is? Just a housing for the doves. So they're built into that structure. That hen house remains as part of the greenhouse structure on the grounds, but there's been additions to it over the years. Let's see. That's the hen house, where the offices and whatnot, wash tub and potty were done, and then on the other side, this is one of the original greenhouses. Like I mentioned, the greenhouse and the duck pond were on the property prior to building the mansion, and Mr. King loved growing things for himself or for friends and whatnot. In the mansion itself, there's actually a flower room that he had just for preparing flowers, and would have them shipped to wherever he was working or staying as well. This is, so as I mentioned, the original head house and the rest of the original greenhouse. That structure still remains today, the base of it, but the greenhouse has been rebuilt slightly to accommodate once we became a public garden. In the 80s, we added this orangery, so it gives you a proper entrance, especially as being a public garden. It just allows for more proper entry. It's possible that oranges and citrus were grown in there, but it's more of a connection point between the rest of the greenhouses. So it's all display in the orangery, and then display greenhouses, as we'll talk about here, and then our production in the back. So we know that he used to use his greenhouse to get plants started for each season, but he especially enjoyed having a constant supply of cut flowers, not only for himself, but as gifts for his acquaintances. Kingwood expanded the greenhouses in the 1950s, so what we saw just a moment ago, that was the original. And in the 1950s or 60s, it was expanded as part of being a public garden. So, as I mentioned, the display houses in production. So there's different houses. Today's greenhouse includes a cactus and succulent house, a display house that kind of changes with potted plants based on just mixing it up over the course of the seasons. A tropical house with bananas and coffee and bromeliads, We have a bromeliad collection that was donated to us a couple of years ago. And then we also overwinter our tundra display plants, so some of the tropicals we use in the displays out on the grounds, we bring those in for the winter. We previously had a garden shop in the back, and with the expansion that we'll talk about here, that was moved, and we have more production space now. So there's an image of that's the retail house with the poinsettias, and so that we changed that up based on the season, and then you can see the succulent house in the background. I don't have too many photos of it, but we also have a couple of poly houses on the grounds that we produce about 6,000 to 8,000 perennials for the garden shop, and then all of our annuals are produced on site, and so it's about 25,000 annuals each year.
Wow.
In the displays. Looking out across the greenhouse is Mr. King's service building. So this was his carriage house, his workshop, or stables where he kept the horses, and then missing on the other side is what must be the world's largest chicken coop. It's quite a building, but it still has the little doors on it, so we let the chickens out. But it was built in the 1930s to support the workings of the estate. So now the area is a favorite venue for gatherings of many kinds. We have weddings and concerts and wedding showers, baby showers, that type of thing. So the carriage house was converted a few years ago as the start of our changes, and so it's a good event space for weddings or whatnot, as well as Roost Hall and the workshop. Is a linking point to both. It has restrooms and then also some of our storage for the organization. So that's what it looks like present day, with a little elm grove providing shade over the course of both buildings. Carriage house in the background. Those doors open up. It's really a unique space. Events, concerts, and whatnot. On the other side of the carriage house, outside of the courtyard, we have the carriage house garden, and this is it's very dark. I'm sorry. It's a very unique space. It's more of a sustainable garden. So it's got a rain garden. All the gutters drain off and follow into this rain garden, which eventually will stage up and then let out into the stormwater system. But this garden is full of edible plants. It's got apple trees, cherry trees, raspberries. So more of that edible style, but also sustainable at the same time. So, talking about the rain garden and whatnot. But it's a great space to allow those weddings, those corporate meetings to branch out into the garden and immerse people into plants. They may not even realize it, but it's an opportunity for them to, have spell-out meetings or a bar for a wedding, and then they're surrounded by plants and they don't realize how great that actually is until if they're not plant people. On the other side of the carriage house, which you can see, that's the chicken coop in the background. So that now is used as well for events, workshops, and the like. At Christmas time, we cut Christmas trees in there, have a tree walk, and the local businesses will decorate. And then the rose garden. The rose garden has traditionally been more of a monoculture of all roses. And we've slowly started making the transition away from just solid roses and more companion plants that will help complement the roses, so bringing beneficial bugs and insects in, but also having season-long interest. Over the winter, this garden, being roses, it looks completely bare, it just sticks. So bringing in some evergreens and things like that just to liven it up a little bit. So you know, you have different people. Some people are traditionalists. It's got to be, you know, strictly roses. But there's a lot of inputs, and we're getting into more and more issues with pests and diseases. Rose rosette disease is one in particular where it's a very nasty disease and very difficult to control. So instead of relying solely on the roses, we're relying on a little bit more. The roses are not gone by any means. It's just more of a compliment. So alongside the rose garden is the herb garden, which used to be known as the parterre garden. We used to have a lot of mums and whatnot. But the previous herb garden was getting too much shade. So a number of years ago, it was moved over there. Herb garden is maintained by one of our gardeners and the Herb Society, local Herb Society, so local garden club that helps out. Next to the herb garden, we have the gazebo garden. Gazebo garden is very popular for weddings and small weddings, but it's a nice tranquil place with a little water feature. It's a nice place to relax. There's a large tree, some shade, and just a beautiful little garden. And next to that used to be our peonies. Our peony garden, we had another monoculture of mainly rows of peonies, and it was really beautiful coming up here in a week or two, and people would love it, and then it would look awful for the rest of the season because of all the pet diseases. So we decided with the Garden Gateway expansion, our previous trial garden was being removed because of the parking lot, and we needed a location to trial plant material. So we made a trip to Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania a couple years ago, and kind of stole a little idea from them where they have these idea gardens. And so we redesigned it, and it's these large squares, and we have 5 gardeners, and each one of them, they get a square, and they get to take that and design it and try different things, try different combinations of plants, try new plants, try plants that we had for many years and just in different ways. But it gives them an outlet, and it's a really beautiful area at the same time. Just a place to trial, a true trial area. The rest of the peonies, we dug what we wanted to spread throughout the garden in different garden areas, and then a lot of them were also donated to OSU in Springfield, so that they didn't just disappear. Local garden clubs took some as well. So the peonies are not gone; they're just spread throughout the garden. We also have a AES garden. Familiar with AES, All American Selections? So it's a display garden. So all of the winners from the past year are displayed in a couple of those squares. All American Selections it's a trial program that basically puts out the best of the best, and then if you're buying annuals in the store and it says AES, you know that it's a good plant. It's been trialed throughout regionally and then also nationally. So we don't trial them, we just display the winners so that the public can see, okay, that's a good variety.
Can you repeat that? If you buy an annual that starts with A?
No, there's an AES symbol. It's All American Selections, and that if it has that stamp on it, it means that it's a winner. It's a winner of. And
that would be on the plant tag when
yes.
I buy something?
Yeah. So a lot of common things you probably buy, I believe like celebrity tomato. Or there's different tomato fruits and vegetables, and then also ornamental flowers and whatnot.
Okay.
So rounding out that area is our service building. So Mr. King's carriage house, workshop, roost hall, it kind of supported the estate. In the 1960s, a new service area was built, and as part of the expansion, 2 years ago we added another wing on, and so everything is consolidated there now. where we've gone over the past 50 years or so. And Mr. King's formal gardens. So in 1926, when the mansion was being constructed, Mr. King commissioned the design and installation of a series of gardens collectively called the formal garden to be arrayed around his swimming pool. I believe the architect was Pitkin and Mott out of Cleveland. And so these formal gardens still are there today, not in exactly the same way. A number of years ago, we had a commission, or a study done to determine how we could bring those gardens back to the historic setting that Mr. King, how he enjoyed them and how they were originally designed. And it's one of our ambitions to work towards that. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Some of the hedges were removed and replaced when we opened to the public in the 50s, and they're well overgrown. Stonework that needs to be done. And once we start, it's a snowball. It's going to take a lot of money and a lot of work. So that's one of our goals. This picture in particular, I believe it's looking through the sunken garden up towards the swimming pool. The swimming pool was up in this area here. And it looks much different today, but there are definitely reminders of what it did look like in the day. So there's a swimming pool. Mr. King often invited his employees over to swim. Swimming pool is no longer there. When we opened, they decided to fill it in, and it's now grass because it would be a liability. But as one of my hopes and dreams is if we can come up with a way to redo those gardens, is to even make it resemble a swimming pool, like a reflecting pool, or something to put that out there that this was Mr. King's pool. What you see in the corner, that brick structure is still there. There's two back houses, and so we still have the changing rooms and things like that. So really, really quite amazing.
When you say reflecting pool, is there as much liability to have a reflecting pool as a swimming pool?
I don't know.
Yeah,
The
that's
swimming
something-
pool would be much deeper.
I never thought about that until you said that.
Yeah, there's no need to have a swimming pool, so instead of redoing the swimming pool, I know there are other gardens that have swimming pools, so I'm not an expert on the liability side of it, but
I'll bet you wish I was sitting home doing.
no, I don't. I appreciate the interaction.
I'm just curious by nature.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, that's just me.
So those gardens remain today as a great venue for our seasonal displays. They carry out throughout the gardens. Let me show you a couple of the more historical photos. This is Pan. Mr. King had three main sculptures in the garden: Pan, Lady of Gallarney, and Satyr. And those they were installed on an axis. And some things have changed over the years, like I mentioned. The steps, you'll see this in the photo going up, the steps remain the same, but there were grass landings, and now they're stone. I don't know exactly what point they changed, but more perennial beds and now they're annuals. The circle pool actually looks pretty similar to the way it does today, but some of those larger trees and whatnot are no longer there. But you still have the access points. Here's Lady of Gallarney. This is one example. At some point down the road, Lady of Gallarney was moved, and so this is probably in Mr. King's time. And right now, instead of being in the middle of the annual bed, she's pushed back up against the hedge. And so that's one of our hopes as well, is to move her back to her original location. As you see these hedges, they're nice and low. You can see the mansion in the foreground. But today they're at least 12 feet tall, and
Oh, wow.
like it's more of a room and totally enclosed. So there's a circle pool. looking back the other way, but you can see the hedges in the background. And in a similar manner, we had replaced, there was traditionally a juniper surrounding the pool, but with cedar apple rust, I don't know if you're familiar with that, we have some hawthorns down in the garden below, and so they would end up getting cedar hawthorn rust real bad. So we decided to change that planting out to be an arborvitae and not have the host on site for that disease. So it still will eventually get a similar size, similar height, and stature, but not exactly the same plant that was there. So, like I mentioned, it's a great place for our seasonal displays. Seder, that arbor structure is original to the garden. That's in the swimming pool area. Just another location. So those are probably some of our gardens that are of most color. Again, I mentioned the grass landings, and you can see the steps are still here, but these areas were all lawn in those photos prior. So it's a lot of work, but very, very enjoyable once, as the season goes along, you have no problem finding color. And then we have slowly, taken on little projects. This summer house was rebuilt 2 years ago in the same manner that it was originally. It was just starting to really fall apart from the original Mr. King's time. So that's all local woodworker put that together and built it in the same fashion. So we're picking away at it a little bit at a time. That is located in the Sunken Garden, and along the same manner, looking down into the Terrace Garden, the access points. So that Sunken Garden in Mr. King's time was traditionally a rose garden, and so we kind of also have this struggle where roses want that air movement, and they don't want the moisture and that help promote diseases. So if we try to go back to the way it was, are we doing this smart thing and trying to put roses in a place that they really shouldn't be growing, or it's a question that kind of needs to be answered. But it's not a wise place to plant them. So let's see. So working down from the formal gardens, the Terrace Garden was near Mr. King's service buildings. There was a vegetable garden, an orchard, his tennis courts, and then over the years, when we opened, I believe the tennis courts were removed and a parking lot put in. And at that point, Kingwood was very interested in collections of plants, kind of like the peonies and the roses, monocultures, particular varieties, mums and cut flowers and whatnot. So that changed when in the 90s, early 90s, the Terrace Garden was installed, and so it's more of a series of pocket gardens, terraces, mixed in with some annual and spring bulbs for seasonal color, but it's more on the natural side and more of a wildlife garden, so for the birds, kind of a nod to Mr. King. There's one section with a large bird feeder, and just more of that natural look. So it's one of the more unique, I think, areas because you can go through that whole terrace garden and see so many different things in these little pockets and really appreciate them. So just a couple of photos here, and like I said, just adding a little bit of extra color with the seasonal displays.
What is the tall purple, do you know?
It's Joe Pyeweed.
Really?
Yes. Joe Pyeweed, and that's what's the interesting part. You have the annuals just on a little strip, and then tying into those perennials behind it. Verbena barnariensis, and cardoons, and then some cannas, things like that. So.
I thought about Jim Highway, but I don't know my budget, though.
seasonal displays tied into everything else. The angel trumpets, we like to use those out in the gardens and bring those out back into the greenhouse for the winter. Water ties into it as well. There's a nice fountain at one end near the formal gardens, and that's a good element of any garden. Just water. It's a good thing. So that's at one end, and then the duck pond is at the other, and so they kind of tie the two ends together. The LA, this dates back to Mr. King's time. Coming out the mansion, just having a nice LA of trees, and perhaps as the heart of the gardens, you could say, especially now since with the changes, as you'll see here in a minute. There's a bench at the end. After the first board chairman, there was a water feature installed at the end of the LA, and so that was a popular element that, as going through this expansion, there's so many questions on, can't believe you're getting rid of the fountain, can't believe you're getting rid of the fountain. Well, we didn't get rid of the fountain, we rebuilt it and made it, because it made it better after 60 years. It was just, it was in disrepair, leaking, and needed a lot of work. So the LA currently is it's a feature of ours, especially for two main points of the year: the spring bulbs, and ties up with the red buds and the other spring flowering trees. It's one of the most gorgeous sights at Kingwood in the spring, and then also for summer seasonal displays. It's unbelievable. So you might imagine, after the recession, we started having events at Kingwood, just branching out different forms of income. So there's a trust that helps fund Kingwood, but then we also charge admission and then have rental income as well. So as you might imagine, it's a fantastic place for weddings. And so after COVID last year, we had so many weddings canceled. Fingers crossed and a little concerned, because in the month of May, we have many weddings. Some weddings where we have 3 or 4 weddings in the same location for the weekend. So hopefully it starts to dry out and we're not having other issues. The area above, this used to be the herb garden, like I mentioned, that moved. And so there's some large trees that really shaded out, and typical herb garden wants more sun than that. There's our new visitor center, so what we call the Garden Gateway. In the past, really since we started charging admission, because Kingwood was free, we started charging $5 a car. That was around the recession. We went up to $5 a person, and we had a ticket booth, basically a little shed in the parking lot that we would accept guests. And so it wasn't a true welcome space. So now we're $5 a person, 12 and under are free. But this provides a good, clear entry point. You come into the parking lot, which is now, it's got bioswales and gardens, so it's not just a paved parking lot, but it's also got plants and trees, and you feel like you're coming into a garden. But then you walk into the building, and you're greeted with a true welcome into the building. So there's the welcome desk. We also added a cafe that's run by Bueller's, the grocery store. So there's soups, salads, and sandwiches. The gift shop, the garden shop, which was down at the greenhouse, has now moved up to the Garden Gateway as well. So we have the indoor greenhouse area with annuals and houseplants and whatnot. The outdoor section for trees, shrubs, and perennials. And then we also added a distinct spot for the gift shop. So that has expanded greatly compared to down at the greenhouse. And then the new gardens surrounding the garden gateway include a rebuild of the popular graphing fountain. It's now lighted. It's much more efficient, and we can now plant around it easier than we could before. So along those annual displays, we have annual beds around the fountain. This garden, because of COVID, was supposed to be finished in early summer of 2020, and because of all the delays, and we had rain and COVID, and so we opened up in October of 2020, so about 6 months late. And so we're going through that first season. So we planted a lot of things in September, October of last year, and so the gardens we're really starting to see what the gardens are going to be, and we're really looking forward to massaging that and bringing those gardens into their own over the course of the next few years. Let's see. There's another look back towards the LA. We have those photos looking down towards the benches, and that where the building is. There's a ballroom that spills out onto that terrace, so you can have your wedding at one end and have your reception at the other, and it's all in one beautiful place. Some gardens that were added to the Garden Gateway project, the perennial garden was redesigned, and so this garden, while it was beautiful, I think it was time for a redo. And so it was broken up into two distinct areas. More of your traditional garden, perennial garden, based off of the inspiration from Rosemary Beery. And so it's lots of color in your the traditional perennial garden style. And that is mostly around this pavilion here. And then as you come up the garden, you get into the Meadow Garden, which is more along the lines of the new perennial garden movement. So I don't know if anybody's familiar with Pete Udall or the High Line or Millennium Park in Chicago, High Line in New York City. They're much more natural, lots of grasses, and sort of your idealistic view on a meadow. And appreciating plants for their beauty, as opposed to, a lot of times in perennial garden you're going to do a lot of deadheading and those types of things. In this garden, it's more letting nature do its thing and appreciating those things over the course of the season. So it's lower maintenance, but you might see, flower heads that you might typically cut off and leave them and appreciate them in that larger context. So it's a little bit of a different way of thinking, but it's really nice. We planted that really late. We had a designer who used to work with Pete called Austin Eichheit. He's out of Chicago, and we had him design that section of the garden. So we planted that in September. Everything was small going in, and we're really seeing that come through. There's also a bulb layer through there, so there's muscari and tulips and daffodils and allium, ornamental onions and things like that. So even while the garden it's a perennial garden, being fairly, it's still early in the season. There's a bulb layer that's coming up that, provides more season-long interest. So, also part of that project, I mentioned the bioswales in the parking lot. So all of our stormwater from the parking lot runs through these bioswales, and it collects and stages up and slows the water and pollutants going back to our nature pond. Nature pond is about doubled in size, and it's going to be another area of education. Back here, there's also a little waterfall, so as it funnels through and gets through the bioswales into the stormwater system, eventually comes out into the stream, which comes through the waterfall, into the nature pond, which stages up, and then slowly lets out into Toby's Run, which is a local stream tributary right behind the property. So, that's a little bit of the history and current happenings at Kingwood. Just so you know, to bring things together, our mission is to create beautiful gardens for the enjoyment, inspiration, and education, based off of the vision of Charles Kelly King. So, thank you for having me today, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
I have to come back,
Yeah.
it's completely different than I remember.
It is much.
I was probably there, maybe in the seventies the last time.
Oh, wow. Then yeah, things really have changed since then.
Yeah.
The latest, but I think it was probably sixties and seventies when I was there.
Well, like I mentioned, I've been there 4 years, and I have seen a night and day transformation.
In that 4 years.
Yeah.
Wow. Do you have a favorite section of the garden?
You know, I think these new areas, the Meadow Garden and that terrace area, I think because we had so much hand in the changes and seeing how things are materializing, it is night and day. You know, I talked about that entry point. I should have put a picture in here. You know, you come into the garden when I started. You come into the garden and there's a shed. Okay, and that's fine. It's a welcome. But now you come in the garden and you go through the building. As you exit, it's like a wow. You know, we have a couple very large fall cypress trees with knees, and so it's a true. You come out the doors and it's a wow. You're in the garden. It's a beautiful area. And just seeing that develop, I think, is probably my favorite.
All right. Well, thanks for presenting, Mark.